start. My name's Liz Tyson. I'm the Programs Manager for Outreach and Animal Welfare for the Palestinian Animal League. PAL is the only animal protection organisation operating in the Occupied Palestinian territories. And today I want to talk to you about an amazing initiative called Sudfeh, which means serendipity in Arabic. What we want to go through, I'm not going to talk a lot about the background of our work. Some of you I know have seen either me or one of my team members speak before about what PAL's all about and what we do. I'm not going to go into great detail about the politics of the region. Most of the time we kind of start these presentations with a kind of potted history of Palestine to put it into context. But today I want to focus on two very specific stories. Now, our work as an organisation seeks to highlight, and always has, the interconnectedness or intersectionality, which has obviously been the theme of today's presentations, which is attributed to Kimberly Crenshaw, the critical race studies scholar, back in the 1980s. So we look at the interconnectedness between systems of oppression, and particularly for us, the connections between the ongoing military occupation of the Palestinian land by the Israeli state, and the way that that impacts and interacts with the oppression of animals in the same region. Our work necessarily, openly, frankly, and unapologetically challenges racism, xenophobia, and Islamophobia, and also other prejudices and forms of violence towards our work, towards the people who are carrying out our work, and which we consider to be a really important and directly influencing factor on our work. One of the things that we are regularly told, particularly my Palestinian colleagues are regularly told, we start talking about our work and then we start talking about the occupation, and we'll say, well, actually, our work becomes very complicated because of this and that, and the system and the wall and the killings and the imprisonments. And people generally white Western people who perhaps have never visited the region, and the hand goes like, wait, come on. I'm not really interested in the politics. Can you not just focus on the animals? That's what it's about. That's what veganism is about. You shouldn't be worried about the politics. Animals don't care about wars. Just focus on the animals. We'll go through whether or not that's even possible, whether it's desirable. You can probably tell by the tone of my voice, some of you already. So let's start off with the first point. Talking of interconnectedness, I'm not ashamed isn't the right word. It's disappointing that once again PAL's presentations are being delivered by this white English woman, as opposed to my Palestinian colleagues, where I'm speaking on behalf of a Palestinian organisation at a conference about intersectionality, where so many people have been talking about privilege and race and class and all of those things, and you've got the white English woman giving you this presentation. Why is that? We're going to talk about that in a moment. Then I want to tell you the story of Sudfeh. So we've got two stories to tell. One is kind of a fairy tale. The story of Sudfeh is kind of a fairy tale. We're all still on cloud nine about this whole project. It's quite amazing. And then I'm going to tell you another story of two young boys, which isn't a fairy story, but it's the reality for young people living in Palestine. And hopefully, I was kind of thinking at the end of this, what exactly is my takeaway message? What's the moral of this? But really, apart from making the point that your activism has to be intersectional, we don't see any other way around it. But also, I think it's more important just to almost bear witness. So I want to tell the stories. We're going to make some recommendations at the end, which is particularly for people like myself, white Westerners, who perhaps don't have personal experience of the situation or the lived experiences that we're talking about. So kind of tips for allies. But that's really as far as we want to go. We just really want the stories to be told. So where are the Palestinians? I want to make this point really clear, that this presentation has been co-authored by Sham, Jawa, Dana, and Mohammed, and me. So Sham, Jawa, and Dana are all 14-year-old schoolgirls. Aurori is a 24-year-old university student at Quds University. The reason this presentation is actually so fun is thanks to them. you'll see as we go through, I'll be doing a lot of reading off the screen because we're using their words. It is very much our presentation, and I'm speaking on their behalf. So if it's been written by 5 Palestinians, who are the ones running the project in the West Bank, why on earth is the only non-Palestinian author the one who's standing in front of you today? I created a helpful infographic to try and explain. So Palestinians, if they want to travel outside of the West Bank internationally, there's probably, I think, 3 countries in the world where they don't need a visa. So you've got to get a visa. You've got to get your passport, and then the wall represents a wall. So many, many Palestinians can't travel into modern-day Israel because there's a bloody great big wall that the Israeli state have built. It's currently about 550 kilometers long. It prevents Palestinians from traveling into Israel, but it doesn't prevent Israelis traveling into Palestine, or into the West Bank, sorry. And what that means, many, many Palestinians simply aren't allowed to cross that wall at all. They don't have permission to leave the West Bank. And the problem with that when you're talking about international travel is that a lot of the places where you go and get your visa are on the other side of the wall. So if you were, for example, if my colleagues wanted a visa for the UK, they would have to go to the embassy in Tel Aviv. Or they can go to the kind of part-time office in Ramallah, which has visa application meetings probably, I think it's about once a month. So if you get your slot, great. If not, then you can't go. So first of all, getting the visa is complicated and it's time-consuming. You have to pay for your visa application, whether you're granted it or not, and that costs between about £100 and £150, which is a lot of money by anyone's standards. Particularly, we're talking about young people here. And then you have to wait. And while you wait, I'm talking very specifically about UK visas at the moment. The UK government hold on to your passport. It should take about 30 days to make a decision. My colleague last year, who actually works in his full-time job in government, the UK government held onto his passport for about 4 months. So effectively, by this administrative protest, our government had managed to effectively deny my colleague any travel rights while they decided whether or not he could come. So you could be waiting a few weeks, you could be waiting a few months, and then you get told yes or no. If it's no, there's never a reason given, and you can't apply, you'd have to reapply again. You can never amend the application. So it could be something like you didn't provide the right bank statement. The obvious solution to that is you just give them the bank statement, they go, okay, tick. But that's not the way it works. That's null and void, start again. So then if you do get the visa, you can finally book your plane tickets. You can already imagine that traveling on short notice is just impossible. You get your plane tickets, or a large number of Palestinian civilians, because they're not allowed to travel into Israel, means that they can't take advantage of things like the budget airlines, which fly from Tel Aviv to the UK. So they have to go via Jordan. Invariably, tickets are far more expensive. In fact, it's about triple. If you were to fly from Tel Aviv to the UK or Jordan to the UK, you're looking at a difference of about £200 return from Tel Aviv and about $650 from Jordan. Then you go through the borders. You have to take at least a day off work to get through the borders because you pass through the Palestinian border, then the Israeli-controlled border, and then the Jordanian border, and that costs you about $150 for the privilege of just going through that process. It will also take you the best part of a day, and then sometimes they just don't let you out anyway, so you just have to turn around and go home. And then finally, you get into Jordan, you go through the normal airport controls, and off you go. For Palestinians, if you stay away too long, you might not be allowed back. In fact, I was just talking to someone here who that happened to her grandmother. She doesn't have the choice to go back. And then when you come back, if you're traveling in interconnected places, you can be held up, you can be denied boarding, and you can just generally be harassed as you travel around. So that was a really long way of explaining why you've got the white English woman standing in front of you instead of my 5 Palestinian colleagues who actually deserve to be the ones who are given the platform to present their work. I don't know who that is. So this probably gives the first concrete example of when people say to you, forget the politics and just focus on the animals, well, wouldn't that be nice? So this is what I've just talked about. So basically, where are the Palestinians? The simple answer to that is they're not here because of racial discrimination. And interestingly, with the UK, we categorically refuse to recognise Palestine as a state, and yet we differentiate completely between Palestinian citizens and Israeli citizens. And it's not to say that I think Israeli citizens should have to go through this ridiculous, convoluted visa application process and all of these trials and tribulations. But what's interesting is that settlers living in illegal settlements on Palestinian land, recognized as illegal by international law, they can go to Tel Aviv and they can hop on that cheap budget flight and they can come into the UK without any questions asked. So on the one hand, how can we not recognize Palestine as a state, yet say actually we're going to treat this part of this population completely differently to the other part of the population, and we'll treat them completely differently to people who are openly, actively, and in a recognized way breaking international laws. And then I talk through the money. And then the final thing is when you go back to Palestine, the border's only open for a couple of hours a day. So that generally means standing in the baking heat, sometimes up to 8, 9, 10 hours. Sometimes you just have to go home because you don't get there in time, or the border closes before you get through. So hopefully that explains why I'm here instead of them. Excuse me a second. So those of you who've seen some of the talks we've done before, you know this kind of become this part, perceptions and how racism manifests itself has become quite a large part of our work, and we often start presentations talking about and asking questions, okay, when you hear the word Palestine, what do you think? And we're not going to do that today because it takes too much time, so I'm going to summarize what we see on a regular basis. And that is, in the eyes of the international community, Palestinians are defined by war, oppression, violence, terrorism, and suffering. Depending on your position on it, they're either the victims or the violent protagonists. Growing Islamophobia, which I'm sure everyone here must be aware of it. I find it incredibly frightening. It further vilifies that story and those preconceptions. So men are seen as oppressors, particularly Muslim men are seen as oppressors. Muslim women are seen as oppressed. And of course, and this is the point, that of course there is war, suffering and violence, and that should never be ignored. And while some men, of course, some Muslim men, some English men, some Christian men, whoever, some women can be oppressors. And I know there will be women in Palestine, Muslim or otherwise, who are oppressed. But people aren't two-dimensional. You can't apply that stereotyping to absolutely everyone and say, this is them, this is what makes up Palestine and Palestinian peoples. And the reason I use this particular photo is because this is what people think of. The young boy burning the tires, the keffiyeh wrapped around his head, the throwing the stones, the soldiers, the tanks, this is kind of quite a stereotypical photo that people would associate Palestine with. So this is something, if anyone hasn't read Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's work, you should. She's an amazing Nigerian author. And she gave this fantastic TED Talk in 2009, and she said this, which just really, it resonated. At the time, we were writing a paper which was about this issue, and she's far more eloquent than me, which is why she's an incredibly successful author. So I've just stolen this phrase. So she said, stories matter. All stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. And what I'd like to do is share with you two stories. I haven't got much time, so I'm going to have to be quick. First one is the story of Sudfeh, and it stars my co-authors, Sham, Dana, Jawa, Siham, Mohammed. It stars PAL, Palestinian Animal League, Quds University, the Sudfeh team, and as with any fairy story, there are the villains and they are the trolls. So, once upon a time, there were 4 young women from Palestine. So we have Dana in the top corner, Sham on the right, Jawa and Siham. And they took part in a program called the Youth for Change program, which is run by the Palestinian Animal League. But the way that the program works is we train university students to become student mentors. They then go into schools and work with school children to develop their own child-led projects for animals or the environment. So it's kind of a real no grown-ups allowed sort of thing. Once the students had been trained, we step back, our team steps back, and we just watch them do amazing things, obviously supporting them when they need it. The mentor in question is the wonderful Mohammed Arori. He's been with our program for about 2 years. He's fantastic. He's been an incredible support to the young girls, and he's sort of mentored them through the whole process. So they dreamed of establishing Palestine's first ever vegan cafeteria. Now, bearing in mind, when we start this program, we work with some, all the projects are amazing, but we were kind of thinking, the kids are going to want to paint a mural on the wall of the school. They'll want to kind of do a play, which they'll show to their parents. And then this group of 14-year-old girls said, we want to establish a vegan cafeteria. We were like, we support you, but that's a bit daunting. So we're like, nope, let's go for it. And everyone in it, we're like, okay, let's see how this pans out. But of course, the trolls tried to discourage them. And sometimes the trolls were actual people who were actively trying to discourage them, and sometimes it was just those niggling feelings you have in the back of your own mind. And what the messages that were coming were, first of all, you're young women. You're not just young women, you're children and you're Muslim women. Like, Muslim women can't make this work. They're oppressed. How can you possibly do this? And you're just children, you're going to fail. That was something that the girls told us a lot, that they felt initially like, we're really young and no one's going to respect our ideas and we don't really know what to do. But they're pretty bolshy, they're pretty feisty, so they just carried on. And so these are their own words. So I'm going to read to you what they said about these particular issues. So Jawa said, why should we care what they say about us? We'll show them that young girls can do exactly the same thing as boys. Sham said, through this whole thing, I didn't think about being Muslim or a woman. I was just being me. I wasn't labelled. I don't care about labels. I didn't want to label myself with anything. We'll leave the labels for others, and then we'll prove them wrong. Dana said that, and this speaks to the issue of particularly of Muslim women and Palestinian women being oppressed. She said, our identity as Palestinian women reflects in everything we do. We are strong, not weak. The occupation made us stronger, and we will prove ourselves. And then Arori, who is a young man living in that society, turned around and said, well, I want to say something about my own mother. He says she's traveled around the world. She's won many prizes outside of Palestine for her work. She's a very successful businesswoman in her own right. The role of women in our society is hugely important, and no one can forget that this idea for this project came from a group of young girls. People believe we're not civilized, and it's simply not true. So the trolls disappear. So then the team called a meeting with the president of Quds University. Bearing in mind, these are 14-year-old girls. I would have been petrified. 14-year-old girls, they don't go to university yet, but they aspire to go to this university one day. So they went and they called a meeting with the president of Quds University, and they said, hey, we want to set up this vegan cafeteria. How are you going to help us? And the president, not only agreed to support them, he agreed to hand over a space on campus for free, rent-free, for them to establish it. And he agreed to allow them to donate 50% of the products of their cafeteria, of the profits, to 50% to PAL's Work for Animals and 50% to set up a student scholarship fund. Frankly, by this point, this group of 14-year-old girls have achieved more than I've ever done, or probably ever will do in my entire career. And so people started to talk about it. And rightly so. It was really, we're just watching these girls go, and we're just like, oh my goodness, what are they going to do next? This is awesome. And we started to get press about it. So this very short article was published in, I think it was Veg News, and it was online. And there's nothing offensive in this. I'm going to read it to you. So the Palestinian Animal League launches crowdfunding campaign to provide plant-based food to 13,000 university students in Jerusalem. PAL launched a crowdsourcing campaign to raise funds for the opening of Palestine's first not-for-profit vegan cafeteria to be located on Quds University campus in Abu Dis, Jerusalem. The cafe, to be called Sudfeh, means serendipity in Arabic, and will also be the first vegan cafeteria in any Arabic-speaking university in the world. PAL seeks to raise £10,000 to cover startup costs, to be used for renovations, etc. Once up and running, the cafe should be self-sustaining, and its income will be used to fund animal protection projects and scholarships for students who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford college. The project is part of PAL's Youth for Change programme, which empowers young people to protect animals and the environment in their local community. You can donate to the project here. Obviously, your reaction to that is what? Amazing young people, this Youth for Change programme, they're going to set up a scholarship fund. And then we dared to say that we were also supporting the BDS movement. And for those of you who don't know the BDS movement, I'll read this because this is sort of the official, it's not my interpretation of it, this is the official sort of terminology from the BDS movement, which is a civil society-led movement, very similar. Lauren from Food Empowerment Project was talking about the boycott of Coke in apartheid South Africa, so very, very similar. So BDS is a Palestinian-led movement for freedom, justice, and equality. BDS upholds the same principles that the simple principle that Palestinians are entitled to the same rights as the rest of humanity. Israel is occupying and colonizing Palestinian land, discriminating against Palestinian citizens, and denying Palestinian refugees the right to return to their homes. Inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement, BDS urges action to pressure Israel to comply with international law. Again, let's remember, it's not just a spat between two countries. They're just asking them to comply with international law. Just stop breaking international law. That would be a start. BDS is now a vibrant global movement made up of unions, academic associations, churches, and grassroots movements around the world. And it's now having a major impact. And anybody who follows the Palestinian cause will see that BDS is becoming it's something that the Israeli state is very scared of. So there's been a big crackdown. So the trolls come back, of course. Hey, welcome. So in response to the fact that we'd said that we support the BDS movement and the cafe wouldn't stock Israeli goods, an animal rights activist came back and said, that comes across as anti-Semitic. Promoting veganism is cool, but there's really no reason to abuse such a position to encourage poisonous divisions between people. This was on my Facebook page, and one of my friends came back, and I wish I'd have thought of this response, said, I can't think of a more poisonous division than a bloody great big wall. And then somebody else said, in your video, you say the cafeteria is vegan, and so there are no animal products nor Israeli products. And she's actually misunderstood, because we weren't saying that veganism was boycotting Israeli products, but even so, we were saying that as well as we weren't going to be buying them. That's a new concept of veganism. Veganism is not being a racist, as far as I know, and veganism is only about animals, so here we go, only about animals, free from hate and politics. So the animal rights movement is free from politics. The one I've been working in for the past 12 years is certainly not free of politics. But let me share with you, it's not my words that I want to share, it's the responses of the young people. So Rory, who himself has been injured quite seriously by the Israeli forces, said, we don't want to support the state that's killing us. We will not support anyone who takes our land. If we were to buy Israeli products, we are supporting the country's economy. Their economy fuels their military. If we stock Israeli products, we're supporting the killing of our people. And Sham said, it would make no sense to me to have a vegan restaurant which is about not harming, which stocks Israeli products. We don't have to harm another soul. If we're using Israeli products, it's like we're paying the Israeli state to shoot our brothers and sisters. This was a really, really difficult interview to record. I cried, I laughed, I had goosebumps for most of it, and just to kind of bring that home, during the renovation, when I was there in the last few weeks, our team had to lock themselves inside the cafe because the Israeli army entered the campus, was firing rubber bullets and tear gassing the students while they're at university. And one of the saddest things about that is that it's so normal. It's, okay, yeah, that's the tear gas, lock the doors. Everyone sits down and waits, and you hear the explosions, and it's the normality of it, the fact it's become so normalized is sometimes harder for an outsider to see than it is if you were seeing people running around and panicking. Every member of our team, and this is a very kind of conservative statement, has known at least one friend or family member who's been killed or imprisoned by the Israeli state. Many of our volunteers have been injured or imprisoned themselves by armed soldiers. And yet, the response to Sudfeh is non-violent, very passive, really. I mean, BDS is a very passive thing. Non-violent boycott protest, which is used across the animal rights movement and has been forever and is seen as a valid tactic, is condemned as racist. But we got rid of the trolls again. And amazingly, the support that we got for Sudfeh was just amazing. We're a tiny organisation. We've never even tried to raise 10 grand before. And we were like, okay, we're a bit nervous about this. We'll see where we get to. In just under a month, we raised the £10,000 needed. 199 people and organisations from 18 countries all over the world supported these young girls. We published interviews with them, and everyone fell in love with them, absolutely fell in love with them. And I want to say thank you as well to Dawn Moncrief from A Well-Fed World, Well-Fed World are one of the sponsors here, because they were a sponsor of the programme and have really believed in it and helped promote it. And also Vine Sanctuary have done the same. So we got the money and we started to build. So this was it before. That was taken by a very, very, very talented photographer, so it looks a lot nicer than it was in the beginning. And then the team began to build. Working really hard, the guys staying overnight, not sleeping for weeks, and then the trolls come back. No one's going to come to your cafe. Palestinians don't care about animals. And then we go back to the kind of Muslim, but what about halal slaughter? And then it goes down that path. And you're not going to find vegan food in the Middle East. Like the diet there is all about meat, said a lot of white people who'd never even been to the Middle East. And Aurora, this was something, again, that Lauren from Food Empowerment Project was talking about food sovereignty and the way that colonization takes away food sovereignty. And Aurora gave a really great explanation. And he said Palestinian tradition is based on arable farming. And traditionally our diet was predominantly vegan. Our families were farmers. But escalation of land loss meant that we've been unable to farm our land for many, many years. Instead, the land was taken away from us and we were forced into refugee camps, or cities away from our homes. International aid packages began to introduce food that wasn't ever part of our tradition. Industrialized food. Spam doesn't come from Palestine, but those were in the international aid packages. And so Sudfeh is serving only traditional Palestinian vegan food. There's nothing weird about it, there's nothing unusual about it. There are dishes that every single person that goes in there recognizes. And asking him, is it important that the food's Palestinian? Is it important that it's Palestinian or just that it's vegan? He said, I think it's really, really important. I think that without the land robbing and occupation, we would still be one of the countries most dependent on plants. And I think it's interesting to think about that when we do hear the troll back there saying, but Israel, the most vegan country in the world, which we hear a lot. Palestine's never been given the chance. We can't pretend that the situation Palestinians are living in is allowing them to reach their potential in any way. So to judge Palestine on the constrictions and restrictions they've had put on them is just, it's naive, and it's simply not looking at a true picture. But they did succeed. Sudfeh opened its doors. I'm aware I've got to speed up a bit. Sudfeh opened its doors on the 10th of October. If you're interested in seeing kind of more of the progress of the development, then have a look at our website and Facebook page. The picture here at the top of the girls, that was their first meal in their cafe. And they were so proud. And they were absolutely blown away. And they said to me, do you really think it's that important what we did? Because I'm kind of fangirl around them. I'm like, they're my heroes. And we're like, but they've got no idea the impact. They've got no idea how many people they've reached, the fact that 199 people put their hands in their pockets and gave this support, that international press was talking about them. We had a fundraiser in Toronto, which blows my mind, because I live in Manchester, and that's just miles away. And it put us in contact with organisations who are now supporting our work. So the legacy of this isn't just the vegan cafeteria. It's also given, these young girls have given our organisation a platform and put us in contact with really important people who will support our work going forwards. Of course, the cafe will also be an activity centre to be used for social justice issues. So we're going to have activities there every week. We've got a book exchange going on already. It's awesome, and the food is amazing. I normally come back from Palestine quite a lot fatter than I usually am, but this time it was even worse. I was eating in Sudfeh like 3 times a day, just because you have to taste test everything. And that's a typical story of, you know, overcoming. The villains come along and they overcome and they succeed anyway, but it's not always possible. So some stories don't have happy endings. These 2 guys here, the little boy in the blue on this side is Ahmed, and the little guy who's actually swearing at the camera, I realised after is Yazan. They're best friends. Ahmed is 14 and Yazan is 13. And they too took part in the Youth for Change programme, but in a different city. They're in Bethlehem. They were working really hard. They're kind of mischievous and a bit naughty. And they were working really hard, and they played a really big role in convincing the municipality of Bethlehem to stop poisoning stray dogs. So they've saved lives, these young boys. On the 26th of August, the boys, who are both refugees from Al-Aida refugee camp in Bethlehem, attended a demonstration. Ahmed, a child, 14 years old, remember, was shot in the head with a rubber bullet. 2 days later at 3 a.m., which is the kind of standard MO, the Israeli armed forces raided Ahmed and Yazan's home, arrested them, and effectively kidnapped them. The children were interrogated and held in prison for 2 weeks. Ahmed, who was released 2 weeks later, tells us he was tortured. We never asked him the details because you can imagine what... I can't imagine that's kind of the point. Yazan remains in prison from the end of August, 13-year-old boy. The children didn't have any parents or adult representatives present during the interrogation. They were literally plucked from their homes and taken to the interrogation centre. Can you imagine how frightened they were? And let's not pretend this is a one-off thing. Let's not pretend this doesn't have a long-term impact on these young people. Ahmed is now out. He remains frightened that they'll come to kidnap him again in the night. Of course you would. You're 14 years old. I can't imagine the trauma that child has been through. It's affected his confidence, and he's now more reserved. His mentor, Rihan, said after the arrest, Ahmed has continued to come to the group, but he's got less will to be active. He's not the same little boy. He now spends most of his time alone and away from his friends. We found out about Yazan and Ahmed because we were doing a graduation ceremony. So the groups work very independently, and then we always do a graduation ceremony for all the kids at the end, and everyone gets a certificate, and we all eat cake, and it's brilliant. And we went to the graduation ceremony in Bethlehem, and Ahmed sort of came up and explained very quietly that his friend Yazan wasn't going to be there. And so Ahmed, pictured here, is holding his certificate with our executive director, Ahmed, Sami, and Rihan. And Rihan is holding Yazan's certificate. And Ahmed had to take his certificate to Yazan's family, who remains in prison. He has a hearing at the end of November. And bearing in mind the reason that they snatched him from his home, the reason they put this child through this trauma is because he was throwing stones at armed soldiers, which happens on a daily basis. So, I'm doing okay for time. So these 2 stories, like I said, the take-home message hopefully is clear, that when you say to the Palestinians, like, forget about it, just rise above the occupation. We joke about it, but it's simply impossible. The Sudfeh team experienced direct racist criticism, as well as ageist and sexist opinions and comments. These were 14-year-old girls trying to do something amazing, and adults were attacking them openly and publicly on the internet because of some skewed skewed hatred towards these people just because they're Palestinian. Ahmed and Yazin experienced direct physical and life-changing violations, which made it impossible for them to continue their voluntary work for animals, or at least in the same way. So this is a reality. Can we really make a reasonable demand that they rise above the politics, which often, we talk about politics as if it's this vague thing, you know, as if it's kind of, you know, a TV debate between two spatting leaders. When we talk about politics in that region, we're often, in fact, talking about human rights violations, direct racism, or other very, very violent behaviour. Should we tell them to ignore that and focus on animals? So the thing I wanted to finish on, and then I'm going to share what our team came up with as kind of the tips that anybody who's interested in working, not just with, obviously with our organisation, you're very welcome if you'd like to, but with vulnerable groups, particularly vulnerable children, particularly people like my colleagues who should be here themselves but can't be. I'm here representing them, and that is a huge responsibility, which I take seriously. But I think the only way to make change for people and animals is to recognise that human rights and animal rights are linked. And importantly, nobody should have the right to demand that any group of people abandon the struggle for their own liberation in order to pursue an aim deemed more palatable for the international community. So we'll finish with this, which is hints and tips kind of based on our experiences, both my colleagues' experiences and also kind of my experiences of channeling some of the criticisms. First of all, remember you haven't lived another person's experience. Don't ever claim to know more about somebody's life don't ever claim to know more than them about their own lives, please. That should just be a basic. It's astounding how often I've heard people say to my colleagues, you're missing my point, when they're literally talking about their families being murdered. And then someone tells them that their point is more important. Check your privilege, examine the gaps in your knowledge, and understand and accept you don't know all there is to know. I certainly don't. The only reason I'm presenting this is because the guys gave me the words. I'm no expert. I've just been trusted with this platform to speak on their behalf. Ask yourself where your position stems from. Why do you have that opinion? You might not fully or even partially understand someone's reaction to a situation. Do you know what? You don't have to. You don't have to rationalize everything. You don't have to make everything fit your parameters. Sometimes you're not going to understand, and in some ways we should be really thankful. I'm thankful that I can't understand what it is to lose a loved one because they've been executed in the streets. I don't ever want to know what that's like. And if you have the opportunity, and really importantly, only if it's not going to be triggering or upsetting for any of the participants, ask questions to improve your understanding or to gain a different perspective. You don't need to agree with them, but at least try and understand where they're coming from. And finally, we thought it was pretty important, so we wrote it 3 times. Just listen. You don't have to have an opinion about everything. Just listen. If somebody is sharing something deeply personal and it comes from a very genuine place and they've lived experiences that you haven't, just listen to them. That's sometimes the absolute best thing you can do. So with that in mind, thank you so much for sitting here and listening to me. If anyone's got any questions, then feel free to ask.